Go on, they can hear us now. So we are have a hot mic and we are go. Hello everybody and welcome to Daddy Chats Live. And here I have with me the ingenious History Revealed, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Joel, but better known as History Revealed. And yep, I'm on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, you name it.
Yeah, and
Now,
oh sorry, go on.
as I was saying, my I say I specialize in sort of not just debunking, but sort of as my account says, revealing history to people. You going to the back to the sources and bringing forth the truth in a world with rampant with misinformation and lies.
Yeah, which is a big issue at the moment. Like obviously we're where people can just go on to places like Twitter and TikTok. The amount of TikTok accounts I see. There was a video. I don't know if you responded to it. I know Pax Ben responded to it, where it was like living without black inventions. And all of the stuff, like she said, a hairbrush was invented in the 1860s when we have Viking excavations where hair, like, you know, imagine people in ancient Greece not using a hairbrush. How, like, that would not end well. But today, obviously, we are specifically focusing on a piece of misinformation on Winston, well, a lot of misinformation on Winston Churchill, looking at the good side and the bad side of his career and his life, and trying to get to the bottom of is he a saint or a sinner? We're not live on TikTok today because TikTok has revoked my live access because TikTok. But I will be answering your questions in the chat, so get them in. So as we discuss, I will take a look at the chat and I will take in questions. So would you like to start off with the common misconceptions of Churchill, how it's been perceived in our modern times?
Yeah. So what's happened to Churchill is best described as a decapitation strike on British history. So sometimes people who want to undermine history or sort of mold it for their own cause. Sometimes they'll start off small. In the
Mm,
case of Churchill, they've gone for the big gun.
they've got
They've
straight.
gone. They've really gone for the jugular. So Churchill had a political career that was around 60 years long, a bit longer, in fact. Well into his 80s, he was still in politics. So
Mm,
over the course of 60 years at the highest level of politics, you're going to have done many things and made many mistakes, and maybe even not mistakes in the short term, but in the long term, turned out to be a bad idea. So they've got plenty of material to work with, but they've chosen him because he's considered such a hero for not just British people, but around the world. I mean, you can go around the world. There are statues of Winston Churchill. There are things named after him.
mm.
I know in Prague they have a statue of him. There's a statue of him in Paris. There's streets named after him. I know that there's one in Israel, and I know there's lots of things in America. Even an American warship is the USS Winston Churchill. So
That's so
he
cool. I didn't
really
know
is,
that.
yeah, yeah. So he's revered all over the world. So if you can take him down, then the whole sort of narrative of British history, it's not that everything will fall before it, but you've taken out sort of the biggest player.
Yeah, you weaken the integrity of the British history as a whole. I mean, it's similar to
Mm.
the videos you've done on the British Empire, because like Churchill, as much as he's seen to us as we grew up, he's seen as a sort of a symbol for freedom and great leadership. And but many people do link him to the empire as that sort of last vestige. Like Queen Elizabeth II sort of shed that, she's seen as the queen who decolonized and was like shed the empire, whereas Churchill was that last real vestige of the imperial institutions. So I think a part of the reason why he's attacked or praised so much now is because it's an easy way to dive in and attack the British Empire. I think it's an easy, like you say, it's an easy scapegoat, it's an easy opening the doors.
Yeah.
And speaking of the British Empire and people who don't like the British Empire, one of my most requested things I've had, especially of late, is talking about Churchill and Ireland. So if we wanted to start there, what was the some of the misconceptions we people have with Churchill there? Was he as violent as it's claimed, or was it less violent, or is in most cases in history the truth is somewhere in between?
Yeah. Well, you've got to start at the beginning with Churchill and Ireland because he's mostly judged on what happened in sort of the Irish War of Independence, so after the Second World War. So he's associated with the actions of the Black and Tans. So there's a myth that he created them. He didn't create them. He did defend some of their actions, even though they clearly went beyond what they were created to do.
Mm.
But that's just the end point. So Churchill's involvement in Ireland goes back to before the war, where he was very much a moderate on Ireland. He supported Home Rule, and he was part of the Liberal Party government.
So he was
pushing for Home Rule.
he was more acting more with autonomy. He wanted the Irish to have more autonomy, much like we have
Yeah.
with devolution with Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland today.
Absolutely, and he was withstanding, not just him, but the whole Liberal Party was withstanding heavy attacks from the Conservative Party for pushing Home Rule, because they were dead against Home Rule. But Churchill supported it. Churchill supported it up until the outbreak of the First World War, where, as we know, everything was put on hold.
Mm.
So his involvement as a moderate in Ireland goes back to that time. And then we have sort of what happened during the Irish War of Independence. And what people have to remember about that, forget about the very specific details of what happened here or what happened there. The Irish War of Independence was fought as a police action with the army, obviously. I mean, it wasn't just the police involved.
Yeah.
But this was not full-scale warfare, either conventional or sort of anti-insurgency, because if it was, the death toll would have been significantly larger, orders of magnitude larger. We're talking full-scale shelling of entire cities and towns, and at that point, bombers were involved in warfare. There may well have been sort of like mass bombing of sort of settlements in Ireland. Obviously, none of that happened, and in the end, it was as much as anything else, it was liberal opinion in Britain itself which brought the war to an end, because full-scale warfare is not what people wanted, either in Britain or Ireland, for that matter.
It would have been brutal to both sides. I've always been able to see, it's with like the Irish War of Independence and stuff. I've always been able to see both sides of the argument. It's the perfect time to try, if you don't want to be part of an empire, the perfect time to break away from one is while it's at a war with a bigger power. But I can also see why everyone else in the empire is going, well, hang on, we're all in the trenches, like fighting for our lives, and you're back home stabbing us in the back. So I can see how both sides can view that very aggressively long into the future, because it's, you know, one side sees it as a complete stab in the back and one side sees it as a fight for freedom. And when you have such irreconcilable views like those, it's hard to coalesce them, because they're just not compatible viewpoints. And like I say, it's the middle ground is often the truth. So how does Churchill get more of like that violent reputation later on? I know, wasn't there he organised shootings or stuff, or allegedly later on in the Irish story?
You know, sort of that sort of specific detail I don't really know, but
That's
I
fair.
can tell you why. Sort of the main people who get the blame for Ireland are sort of him and Lloyd George, and it's for a variety of reasons. And often very fast changing reasons. So if Churchill becomes a sort of convenient scapegoat, is normally because someone wants something in the present rather than what actually happened in the past.
Yeah.
I don't know that sort of immediately after Irish independence was Churchill viewed as such a villain by Irish people. I'm not aware that he was. I'm really not aware that he was. Sort of why sort of maybe certain Irish nationalists, or maybe not even nationalists, but just sort of historians would choose to pick on Churchill for what he did in Ireland at any particular point. It's probably because of some battle going on in the present. But like I say, sort of the overall context of Ireland being fought as a police action and not a full-scale war can't be underestimated. And also the fact that Churchill, especially in the peace talks at the end, he was involved in bringing people together, which included people like Michael Collins, and it also involved negotiations with equally sort of hardcore unionists in Ulster. So the idea that he was just a sort of Irish-hating, villain who loved to dish out violence upon these people who he hated is just complete rubbish.
It's almost if like he's trying to be lifted, or or dragged down to the level of sort of a Cromwellian villain
Yeah.
in a way. But looking at the harsh actions that Churchill has been accused of, it brings us on to our next point. Churchill's actions in Wales, which he is accused, I think, in places possibly treated harsher than he is with his how he is in Ireland or looked at in Irish history, I think. So what happened and went down in Wales that pushed forward this narrative?
So most of the story involves what happened in a Welsh mining town in South Wales called Tonopandi, which is spelt Tony Pandy, which is confusing for English people. And what happened there was Churchill was involved in sort of negotiations with miners over a strike, and it got ugly because the miners started rioting and they started looting, and the police, who were very aggressive with the miners, lost control. And the police in South Wales asked Churchill to send in troops to restore order. And he wasn't gun ho, as in, right, we send in the army, uh, the shooting starts now. Not, it wasn't like that at all. He actually held the troops back at first, and the troops were very sort of gradually used, and no shot was ever fired. I mean, that's what you must remember,
Mm.
is that no miner was killed by a soldier in Tonopandi, but the sort of legend that emerges around this. I mean, like even the Shadow Chancellor a few years ago, John McDonnell, he said publicly Churchill ordered the army to shoot striking coal miners, which he absolutely did not do.
Which is
Absolutely did not do.
which is when you have such someone in such a prominent position saying something like that. It's almost coming more from a place of emotion, which I've seen time and time again with more historical figures. I think the casing point would be the modern case for Boudica, where she's seen differently at different points in time. Like the Victorians saw her as this great liberating woman who was fighting against the Romans when ironically was being pushed by an empire. But today it's the same. She gets that same treatment, but from a different political standpoint. And when I come along and say stuff like maybe her burning an entire city with 70,000 people in isn't okay,
Yeah.
and it's those falsehoods where people try to either justify or completely flat out lie. So, but from what you're saying, the actual incident in Wales was not only massively overplayed, but also he didn't spend as much time. Like from the way it sounds when people talk about Church in Wales, it sounds like he was running around for ages trying to actually torment everyone.
Yeah, not at all, not at all. And it became such a sort of, the whole episode became sort of mythologized. It was it, I've heard it described as sort of it went down in socialist mythology. So, and I really like that description. And my
Mm.
favorite story I read about Churchill and the Welsh miners was an Oxford professor reported how a student came into one of his classes and said very confidently that
Oh, we've lost signal.
Wales.
I lost you there briefly. Sorry, I lost
You
you
lost
there
me.
just after you said about the professor who had a student come into his classroom. Okay, out for a
Okay,
second.
so he had a student come into his classroom and say that Churchill had ordered tanks to be sent in against the miners in South Wales. And the best part about that story is the tank hadn't been invented yet when this happened. This happened in 1911, I believe, and the tank wasn't used until the Battle of the Somme, so in 1916. So amazing foresight by Churchill to be using in things that hadn't been invented yet against the
Yeah,
Welsh coal miners.
I mean, I can see where they've made the connection. Obviously, the Churchill was quite pivotal in the bringing of the tank there, but obviously they've not done a very basic Google search to see timelines. And but talking about weapons on the battlefield and weapons of mass destruction as they would have been seen at the time, Churchill's use of poison gas. Where does this myth originate and what's
So
it
it's
for?
hard to know exactly where this one comes from because what the sort of critics of Churchill have done is they've done sort of the oldest but sort of dirtiest trick of misrepresenting someone is where you cut off a statement they've made, cut off half the statement, so the statement means something completely different. So
Mm.
what they cite is they cite a quote of Churchill's where he's talking about using gas against tribes in India and Mesopotamia, so modern day Iraq.
Yeah.
And what he says is the quote is, "I'm strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes," and then they leave it at that. They leave it at that. So
Mm.
the implication there is Churchill wants to gas the Kurds, are the people in question for the most part, all the Indians. But then they leave out the rest of it, where he says gases can be used that spread, and they use this quote as well: spread a lively terror, but leave no serious permanent effects. So he was
Okay.
talking about tear gas.
Yeah. Which is
Tear
what?
gas, which is used by every single country, every modern police force.
Yeah.
A perfectly sort of legitimate thing to use. But the way they cut up the statement, it makes it look like
If you separate the statement, it sounds like he's trying to because especially with that time period, everyone envisions the slow creeping mustard gas, like coming along the battlefield. And I think what the way that statement's split up from the way you're describing it to me, it does sound very much like that's the envisioning. That's what they want you to envision, want you to picture, is that like just
exactly.
poor load of people in India peacefully protesting, and then the mustard gas rolls in, which is like you say, but the entire world uses tear gas. Like now, there's especially the Americans.
Yeah. Oh, everyone does. I mean, the French used it recently in the protests in all over France over the pension reform. Like every country uses tear gas, but the way that's said, and it's always just sort of like these sort of things are just sort of thrown out of statements like, oh, Churchill shot the coal miners, Churchill gassed the Indians or gassed the Kurds. But it's really easy to say that, but to explain, it's like, well, actually, no. Churchill wanted to use tear gas against them, and by the way, it never happened. He suggested that he supported using it, but they never ended up using it one way or the other.
So he was only putting forward an idea to really. The thing is, when you take things out of quotation like that, I mean, there's a million things that are probably said in every government building around the world constantly, like half as a joke, sometimes serious, as different politicians and different cabinet members are trying to put forward ideas of how to deal with different crises. And obviously, it's a history channel. I'm not going to try and avoid commenting on modern political stances. That's how you get in trouble on Twitter. You find yourself on Reddit. But looking at like the decision-making process before we go to our big crescendo on Churchill and maybe look at a little bit of the British Empire, war plan. I think it's war plan. No, it's not war plan red. That's against the Americans. The Operation Unthinkable. That's it. Operation Unthinkable is the one that people use. I've heard more and more recently that people are using to sort of derail his thought process. If I'm honest personally, I think Operation Unthinkable kind of makes sense, especially with the hindsight of the Cold War. I think it would have actually ended up saving a lot of lives. Do you think Operation Unthinkable is as unthinkable as it's claimed, or was it more sensible than people give it credit for?
It was probably too little, too late.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, there you go. Are we back? I've got you back. There you go.
Nice. Okay, well, where did we cut off?
I heard part of Roosevelt, and then like I missed just before. I do apologise for everyone watching. I'm not 100% sure what happened there. I think my internet, that was my end, went down. I just saw red everywhere, and it all shut down. That's the problem when you're not a big studio.
Yeah, forgive us. One day we'll have the best equipment known to man. Until then,
Yeah.
we're building up.
Yeah, you've got to deal with me quite literally broadcasting from my bedroom.
Yeah. Bedroom broadcast, it comes with the territory.
Yeah. As you said, so I cut off just before you said not most people don't know, and then I heard a bit about Roosevelt, and then you disappeared.
Yeah. So Roosevelt was quite naive about Stalin's intentions, and one of the things Churchill wanted to do was to advanced through southern Europe and cut off the Soviets in Eastern Europe before they got too far in. But
Mm.
Roosevelt wasn't keen on it, and when Churchill tried on his own with British troops, it didn't work out. The Germans were able to stop Britain doing it.
Mm.
Um, so it's maybe if the Americans had been on board, something like that could have worked. But yes, Operation Unthinkable. By that point, I think just that everyone was just too weary by that point. 6 years of fighting, and then the war's over. Are you really going to tell all the Allied armies, right, we're going to war again? This time now against the largest, most powerful army in the world? Maybe not.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It depends, and it comes in from 2 points of view, because the Soviets, of course, a lot of their power came more so from trade with the Americans and the Brits. So that there is an argument to be made that they possibly would have crumbled quite quick without that trade. Oh, there we go.
I think it could be. It could be. I just think sort of the morale thing would have been really hard to sustain, even if you're arguing man for man, or sort of comparing the equipment. Could it have been done? The answer is maybe, but just in terms of asking a whole nation to fight another war, having just finished one, I just think that was just out of the question, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. And with that, we now move on to the biggest part, and perhaps the most aggressively pushed story about Churchill.
Yeah.
In fact, earlier, as I was scrolling through, obviously I had the Churchill stuff up, and I was like, when I was trying to get the thumbnail sorted, which, by the way, guys, the thumbnail idea was actually from History Revealed. That wasn't my the angel and the devil Churchill. That wasn't my idea.
Yeah.
I've lost my own train of thought now. That was it. Yeah. No, that was it. The quote I saw earlier was that because of this one thing, and a lot of his treatment in India as a whole, because someone quoted that he favoured the Greeks because they were strong white Europeans, which I know for a fact isn't true. As someone who's very much into Greek history, I know exactly why he funneled that food in. But I'm not going to steer the conversation. I know that's going to be clipped, and he steered the conversation. But the reason I bring it up this quote is because he was claimed that Churchill's beliefs were the same as Hitler's, and that was a quote I saw as I was reading earlier to make sure I had enough knowledge. So, without further ado, the Bengal famine.
Right, well, where do we begin with this one? So I'll just start on the motivations for it. Now, unlike the Welsh miners myth, this one is far more recent. You won't find, going back 50 years, even 40 years, people weren't saying this. Whereas the miners one is from the time. So this is very much a sort of a modern attack that, again, it's just sort of like this had to be used. It's sort of really suited sort of like anti-colonial forces either in India or in Britain or wherever else. And it sort of contributed sort of like the changing view of the British Empire. It's sort of viewing it as not something that can be judged as, maybe it had more good than bad, maybe it had more bad than good, but just looking at the whole thing as a complete unadulterated evil.
Yeah, I got in trouble for that a long time ago. I put a video. Do you remember when there was a very viral sound where it's like the Soviet Union being bad is Cold War American propaganda? Yeah. I did a video on that doing the same with the British Empire, and that was my first experience being dogpiled on the internet, and I didn't handle myself at all well. I completely folded, but it's.
Oh no, did you?
Yeah, I do regret that. I should have just been like.
I don't think I've been. I don't feel I've ever been dogpiled.
It'll happen. It happens.
It's happened. It's happened in the sense that it's happened, but plenty of my own followers have fought back.
I was a lot smaller at this point, so I didn't have as much of a following base. I just got one-sided dogpiled. But what I've learned over time is that history is that there was a Tom MacDonald quote I heard a while ago was every flag around the world has a little blood, and that's the dark truth of it. And I think that people now, it's as we were saying at the start, it's people will take one historical fact and use that to perpetrate and fulfill ideals and battles that they are currently doing now. And I think that's one of the reasons, as you said, it's the Bengal families now as such a big and easy talking point, when in fact, yes, the famine happened, but the reasonings behind the famine and how it came to be are, I think, far more up for dispute than certain modern sources would suggest.
Yeah. So the beginning point with the Bengal famine is, in terms of responsibility, is Japan.
Yes, oh, 100%, yes.
It's Japan. So if any Indian is ever angry about the Bengal famine, they should be looking east, not west. It's Japan's responsibility, because Britain had abolished is maybe the wrong word, eradicated peacetime famine in India.
Mm.
Famine was present in India for thousands of years because of the variable monsoons, and it was only sort of British efforts to relieve the famine, with famine in general, not the Bengal famine, which eradicated it in peacetime. So if there was a famine in a particular area, they would ship in food supplies, grain, whatever, rice from other areas to the affected area, and that worked very well. However, during World War II, that wasn't possible because Burma had been captured.
Mm.
So any supplies coming in from Burma are out of the question. It's now under Japanese occupation, and of course the Japanese completely ravaged any territory they got hold of, including parts of eastern India. So the eastern states of India, they did get in a little bit. The area where Kohima is, where the famous battle took place.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there was a terrible famine in Bengal. Now, the idea that Churchill is responsible, I don't know how people sort of come to these conclusions. They again, it's like they like to take these little quotes. He may have said, he may have said, when he heard about famine, it's like, oh well, it's the Indians' own fault for breeding like rabbits. It's reported by someone as being said. It's not a written thing. We don't have a formal account of it. It's the sort of thing he would say.
Yeah.
He made statements like that. So that was his personality. He would say something like that.
I mean, he quite famously, I can't remember the lady he said it to, where she like had a go at him and said, "Oh, I would hate to be your wife because you're always drunk," and then he quickly responded, "Oh, well, when I wake up, I'll be sober and you'll still be ugly." It is the sort of off the cuff, unhinged thing he would say. Yes, it's wrong to say it, but is it a 100% piece of proof? We do actually have a rebuttal to your argument in the comments. It's the first direct. I think it's a reference to the quote I was saying earlier from Steve Dobbs. We've got Churchill's. Hang on, I'm going to move my screen so I can see the comments. Churchill's own Indian secretary, Leo Amos, wrote that when it comes to India, there wasn't much difference between Churchill's outlook and Hitler's. So apparently that is from his own Indian secretary.
In general, or is that in regards to anything specifically?
I don't know. That's just the quote that's been placed in the comments.
Well, I've not heard that one, but I don't know what Hitler's particular view on India was.
I know Hitler is quite famous, well, obviously for a lot of things, but quite famously for saying on the Indian question that the British should shoot Gandhi, because people don't realize Gandhi was protesting a lot earlier than he was, when I mean, it was only 1947 that India would be given independence. It was actually very quickly after the war, which is one of the reasons it was so horrifically rushed and was one of the worst ways of independence in history.
I'll just carry on with the Bengal famine.
Yeah.
The other thing to remember is sort of like most of the governance at this point. This was very late in British rule. It was mostly being done by Indians. So there were, and I can't remember the exact details of how it worked, breaking it down per state in India, but lots of these places actually sort of had some form of democracy where people were elected, and lots of the management was going on by Indians themselves. And as much as they don't like to hear it, there was grain hoarding going on. people who wanted to inflate the price of grain and make more money on the crisis. Unfortunately, in famines all over the world, that sort of thing happens.
And it's a regular occurrence. Human beings are human
Yeah.
beings. When disaster strikes, there will always be opportunists who are then like, okay, well, this is my chance to rise. If you look at any
Yeah.
real famous dynasty, that like the Tudors didn't come out of peacetime. They came out of like a series of brutal civil wars.
Yes,
Like
absolutely.
that.
Decades, maybe centuries long.
Yeah, it's that like the House of Capet in France, the Habsburgs came out of great turmoil in
Oh
in
yeah.
the Holy Roman Empire and became the most powerful dynasty in Europe. And it's chaos and disaster that breeds opportunistic people, and they're the people that tend to rise to the top, which is why I am often very critical of leaders throughout history, because
And the
there's a
other thing
reason.
is,
Sorry, go on.
yeah, in terms of the shipping, um, the Indian Ocean was full of Japanese submarines. So sending shipments, which would have taken months to arrive, food shipments, was very difficult because they would get sunk by the Japanese Navy.
Yeah,
So famine relief was very hard, and you could even see um, there's documents, actual written documents, not hearsay, of Churchill reporting the terrible situation of the famine in India to Roosevelt and asking for assistance. Now, I've not heard any good argument from any of his critics. If he hated Indians so much, if his goal was to kill Indians, why on earth would he ask for help to feed them? It doesn't make sense to me.
it does. That I could see him definitely just by the time period he was grown up in. I can see him having prejudices, but whether or not those prejudices transcended and made him want to genocide people, I think that's a
Right.
very hard leap to make.
Well, in terms of his prejudices, it's hard to say because sort of it might be uncomfortable to us now, but a lot of what he was saying in terms of sort of like the level of civilization of sort of the British Empire vis-a-vis India or Africa, he said it in his own sort of quite like blunt and sort of crass way. But
Mm.
what he was saying was true. Sort of at that time in history, Britain was at a higher level of civilization than India was and than Africa was. Earlier on in history, it was completely different. Obviously, like one of the earliest civilizations in the world was in India, whilst Britain was not quite cavemen, but not much more than cavemen.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at when the Egyptians were building pyramids, not by aliens, before someone puts that in the chat or the comment, I know that's the first thing someone's going to put in the chat. It wasn't aliens. That when the Egyptians were building the pyramids, we were building Stonehenge. Which, to be fair, I will say Stonehenge was still
Yeah, it's pretty good.
an amazing piece. Is also a video I do want to do one day of the migrations, because everyone still believes, as a someone with Celtic ancestry, I always bring up the Celts aren't indigenous to the British Isles. There was one, definitely two migratory groups possible.
Yeah.
Again, this is what I meant to say when I go on tangents.
Yeah.
To before we go off, and then we'll finish off as we close in how long
I'll
we
just
go.
say sort of like Churchill is absolutely pilloried for that, but
Mm.
unfortunately, sort of like put to one side his particular way of saying it, it was just a fact.
Yeah, he
So
had.
Europe had industrialized. Europe had gone through a process. Europe, North America had gone through a process which Asia and Africa had not done at that
Well,
point.
it's the same. It's the we're experiencing the reverse now. I don't like doing modern politics. This is more like geopolitics, so we can get away with it, without getting too cancelled. But if you look at China and Japan now, their technologically, they are leaps and bounds ahead. Militarily, I don't know. I like obviously they, for obvious reasons, keep it secret in Japan. You know, because they were quite brutal in World War II. Still doesn't have a military, has a defence force. So
Yeah.
that's just how development goes. The East is now currently, India is on its way to be a superpower. It will be. It
Well,
doesn't
I'd say
treat.
that's up for debate. I say that's up for debate. I think
Oh,
a lot
okay,
of people are. Yeah, I think a lot of people are quite overly optimistic about that. But that's a whole nother story.
that's fair enough. Yeah, I would say inequality is very rampant still in India. I would
There's
argue that.
lots of things that
Um,
get in the way.
but yeah. So just quickly before we move on to our last little bit, we'll talk about. I want to specifically talk about the West India Squadron, if that's right. West Africa Squadron, yeah. West Africa Squadron. That's one that's not often brought up enough, and I think it should be taught a lot more.
Yeah.
But so with the famine, the last final argument that I've heard so many people make is obviously you've said that it's difficult to get the ships there, and obviously grain hoarding and parts of India who can't get supplies across. A lot of people say his choice to send more supplies to the Greeks is a sign of racism. Would you say that, or would you say that was just military planning and tactics?
I think logistics.
Yeah.
I would say that's logistics. More than anything, I have heard that one. I can't remember the exact details. It has been addressed why supplies were sent to Greece and not to India. But I think the other thing to remember is that at this time, 1943, when the famine's happening, there are well over 1 million soldiers, volunteer soldiers in the British Indian Army, and many of them are from Bengal because Bengal is a very populous region of India. The idea that they would carry on fighting voluntarily for the colonial power whilst their own people are being deliberately genocided for that by that colonial power, I just think is so utterly ridiculous that anyone can see through it.
I think the counter argument could be that they weren't being told. It wouldn't be the first time the military has had details from back home hidden from them.
I mean, it's possible, but like if you just sort of think about like the variety of ways that soldiers were being stationed, so they weren't all on the front line all the time. Sort of troops are rotated. They will have had leave. I mean, I really don't know the exact details of sort of the activities of the British Indian Army. But the idea they could have kept an entire deliberate genocide secret from
hidden.
the troops in their own army for any length of time, I think is utterly ludicrous. And I'd love someone to give me an example of some other time in history where soldiers from a certain population were voluntarily fighting in an army whilst that country they're fighting for is genociding their own people. It's just were the Armenians fighting for the Ottomans like voluntarily whilst the Armenians are being slaughtered by the Ottomans? I don't think so.
That's probably one of the best counter arguments, because the Armenian genocide happened because the Ottomans were like, oh, they didn't fight hard enough and therefore they must be against us, and of course that led to a very big uprising, which sadly the Armenians did lose. But I think we've definitely, as we move just before we finish off with something a bit more on a positive note, which is why I wanted to end off with it, because it is a fight against slavery. I think the answer to the question is Winston Churchill, a saint or a sinner? Is he's a human being? He made mistakes and he's sat in that middle ground. I don't think glorifying him is a good idea. I think, like when I do it with Alexander the Great, everyone knows it's mostly a joke. I'm not revering him as this sort of godlike figure that I do the joke with, but I also think attacking him for making very human mistakes in a time of like what he was facing was the greatest threat mankind had ever seen till that point, essentially, was if Hitler had won, the world would have gone back thousands of years in human rights. That's what he was up against.
Yeah, it was spelled out to me one time. If Hitler wins against Britain, you've got two choices. Either Germany wins the war or the Soviet Union wins the war on their own.
Which is...
I'm not sure which is worse. Like you've got two atrocious choices there.
You've got one person responsible for the Holocaust, one person responsible for the Holodomor, which...
Yes, absolutely. But I would say that you're right in saying he's a human being, but in terms of, I'd say he's far more a saint than he is a sinner.
Yeah, he leans more towards the saintly side.
And I really don't think there's any problem glamorizing him. If we're going to, either we have the view that there is no hero and there's no villain in history, or we're comfortable with the fact that some people will be glamorized, and as long as we acknowledge he was human and did make mistakes, I don't think there's any problem in treating him as a hero.
I can see your argument there, because obviously, as someone, I've always been obsessed with Scotland since I was a little kid. I want to move up there one day and stuff like that. William Wallace is, he's seen as a very strong national hero in Scotland, but as he's been pointed out, he did do some war crimes. He did do some war crimes. And so I can think, yes, obviously he's a figure of Scottish independence, which is a big thing now. Even still, again, goes back into, is he being utilised for modern problems? But I can see where your argument's coming from. Is like, yeah, it's allowed kids can grow up and idolise this freedom fighter, but at the same time you have to accept that he did some horrific acts in himself, which is probably
He did, and
no.
also,
Sorry, go on.
just the last thing I'll say, but it annoys me a bit about William Wallace and sort of Scottish nationalists and medieval history. My favourite description of, admittedly, this isn't William Wallace, but still, the Battle of Bannockburn is where you have two French-speaking aristocrats fighting with sort of English and Welsh speaking peasants against Scottish, well, whatever language,
Yeah,
Scots or mixture of Scots and English speaking peasants, for the right to which French speaking aristocrat, both from Norman stock, becomes king. Is that really a nationalistic war? I wouldn't say so.
yeah. I mean, Robert the Bruce was half English as well. If you trace his lineage back,
The Bruce family had many lands in England.
they were like, but I do like, just as a quick side note, I do often see the history of the British Isles essentially being England, Scotland, and France taking turns in systematically beating each other when they're all ruled by the French, anyways.
Exactly.
Like they're all three would have ruled by the French, anyways, and it was as is always the case. The lower classes and the peasantry were the ones that you suffered. But moving on to the little more the positive, uplifting, well, kind of. There's obviously it's very like obviously it's
people something to cheer about.
Yeah, something cheery over than historical misinformation. Obviously, famines and genocide. The West Africa Squadron, which a lot of people argue was like, oh, when the slaves were liberated, all the money was given to the slave owners. When there's a lot of the reason we was in so much debt is a lot of money was actually spent on the West Africa Squadron, which I know attacked French ships, American ships. I know there was actually a guy who went to the Ottomans as an embassy trying to convince them to abolish slavery, and they literally laughed in his face. But that's my Ottoman Empire hatred showing, because so I'm very well known for hating the Ottoman Empire. But so, what could you tell me about the West Africa Squadron to finish off?
So, the idea of the West Africa Squadron was to patrol the coast of Africa to prevent anyone slave trading, and they freed over 100,000 slaves. This was an operation that went on for a very long time, and many British sailors died whilst conducting the operations, often of disease more than the fighting, because the conditions on Royal Navy ships back in the day, disease was a very common killer. And it was used to, it wasn't just capturing slave ships, there was plenty of that, but it was also used to pressure local lords to stop slave trading or to abolish slavery itself. But most of the actual abolition only took place once Britain actually formally took over these territories as colonies. But so much money was spent on the West Africa Squadron over a long period of time, and the amount of ships they captured stopped so much. And it's not just the raw numbers they captured, either ships or slave traders, or the number of slaves they freed, but also the deterrent effect they had. Because the slave traders were scared of the Royal Navy, they stopped what they were doing, and that had a very sort of positive effect in stopping sort of slave trading on the African coast, and they virtually wiped it out. The actual the sort of the coastal slave trading. Obviously, as you go further inland, it's harder to enforce. But there's great pictures of, and I'm not sure actually if it was officially the West Africa Squadron, because where the line between the West Africa Squadron and the regular Royal Navy is, in terms of anti-slavery operations, is somewhat blurred. So the blockade of Brazil, for example, people don't know this. Britain blockaded Brazil and said, you will stop slave trading. That's why Brazil stopped slave trading.
Didn't know that fact.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
It didn't. And I can't remember if they stopped trading and abolished slavery itself because of the blockade, but they certainly stopped trading. So it's, I don't know if people know this, but more African slaves went to Brazil than any other territory in the Americas.
I have heard that. I did know that Brazil was one of the most egregious, Brazil and Portugal, because everyone goes, oh, Portugal abolished it first, if you look at the timeline, and go, but they were also some of the most egregious slave traders. I mean,
they had the largest numbers. They had the largest numbers of slaves go to from somewhat more southwest Africa to their colony in Brazil.
I mean, there is with the entire story of the West Africa Squadron and Britain's fight against slavery. I think it is almost inspiring is, again, I don't do politics and stuff on here, but I am very openly anti-authoritarian, free speech, and very openly anti most government control. And I think it's important to state that while the government, for a majority, may have tried to fight against this, it was the British public, the sheer force of the British public, were like, we are against this. And I think that it is inspiring like in a way to think that in the public of an entire nation, of an entire empire, stood up and said no, and the government bowed down and became a fighting force against.
Yeah, they
slavery.
did. It was sort of government run in the end, and you can see what I think that's what's so interesting and so important that people remember it, is that no other not no other country, because other countries did, but it was only sort of Europeans and their offshoot societies who decided on any large scale that slavery was immoral. For the most part, people didn't like themselves being enslaved, but they were quite happy to enslave others.
Yeah, that's the entirety of human history.
Yes, that is all of human history, and it was only sort of Europeans, and people will say yes, Haiti abolished slavery first in the sort of anti-slavery revolts. I understand that. They also effectively, recreated the plantation economy, but that's a whole separate.
That's another live stream to discuss.
Yeah, that's a whole separate one.
I mean,
the obsession with Haiti is so annoying. It really is.
You can get into Napoleon and stuff, and how Napoleon's revered as a liberator in many cases, but the stuff he did in those plantations.
Exactly. But the fact that Britain used its military might and spent its money, its own treasure, on forcefully abolishing slavery around the world and stopping slave traders, that's completely unprecedented in human history.
It's unknown.
For some reason, just sort of the critics of Britain and the British Empire and the West in general just completely ignore that.
Yeah,
completely ignore that.
And it's hard to understand why they ignore it as well. Like it's convenience. Pardon me. It's those the little details that people forget. And like I say, yes, there's no such thing as an empire that was a force for good. There's a reason that in Star Trek, the Federation, which does the exact same thing as the Galactic Empire, is seen as the good guys. You can't have an empire that isn't ultimately a force for good, but you can have people who take the power of an empire and utilize it in a positive way. And I think that is the shining light in the darkness, is the takeaway. And I think, as a hope for as much as I tend to knock humanity and say we're a violent bunch of apes, we do ultimately, I think, I think ultimately we come through and we like to help each other. Often against each other, but we have to help each other against each other, but still. Closing off, where can people find you currently? I know obviously you're on YouTube and fighting another banner on TikTok.
Oh, God. I'm currently on a war on several fronts right now, across the whole of social media. So they can find me on YouTube. I'm not banned on anything, but there's lots of fighting going on. I'm on social media on YouTube as History Revealed, also on TikTok, History Revealed, and Instagram, History Revealed. Newly growing on Instagram, so please join and join the good story for me right now, which is growth on Instagram. So jump on the bandwagon.
Instagram is the only front I think any of us, like both of us, are having the best joy on Instagram.
Yes.
Shadow banned on TikTok. YouTube isn't paying me yet, but Instagram I'm growing.
I'm strongly shadow banned on TikTok right now.
Right. I'll thank you guys for. Hang on. Have we got a comment?
I've got a question.
We do have. We've got a few. There's a few comments, but it's mostly people talking to each other. There we go. One comment to both of us. Actually, no, we actually got a couple. Wow, people have popped up just as we're about to finish off. That's when everyone starts popping up. It's always the way.
What we ask you?
It's the principality ideals that reach one point. Some were set high. I think that's in response to the West Africa Squadron. Star Trek reference completely wrong, but still a Star Trek reference. Fair play.
I have no
clue.
means of challenging you on the Star Trek reference. I don't know anything about Star Trek.
I'm Star Wars. I couldn't. I know
Yeah.
like the Klingons and the Romulans are related. No, the Romulans are related to the Vulcans or something, and I know that.
Yeah.
History Daddy sums up. Enjoy the less stress work play. Well, we're still stressed. We're both still fighting wars, especially History Revealed is. There's a latest.
I'm in an epic battle.
Your 9/11 reaction video, I believe, is still available on Instagram, though, isn't it? Or is it
on YouTube? It was completely untouched on both of them.
But it's just
Only
TikTok. I will not repeat anything I've said to you offline because we'll both get in trouble with TikTok if I say anything. Yes. I know better than to publicly speak out about TikTok. I've learnt my lesson there. TikTok more like tick not. Yep, very play, and Star Wars for life. Agreed. Okay, well that's finished off. Unless you've got any final words you want to say to everyone.
No, thank you for joining, and I hope someone learned something or thought expanded their knowledge and made them want to learn more.
Yeah, and if you disagreed with anything we've said, feel free to reach out to me, and maybe we can either both either of us, and maybe we can organise a discussion panel in the future, which is something I'm sure you'd be up for. Maybe not tomorrow, but like a discussion panel in the future if we can organise it. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I've said my outro wrong. I have one job, it's to get the outro right. Right. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. And end stream. There we go. Hang on.
We're offline.
Gonna mute us.